This is our first virtual conference. I much prefer the in-person conference. I like to see everybody and to be able to say hi and conversate a little bit. But at least I still get to see familiar names and kind of say hi to everybody virtually at least. So welcome to the Managing the Electronic Record session. My name is Christy Swenson and I am a program manager with SACE. And this session is important to all user levels, whether you are a first-year teacher or an advanced admin level user. Everybody is going to find some valuable information in this session, as we are going to go over the entire IEP process from when a student enters special education until they exit. So before we begin, let's just do a quick Zoom recap. I know you've been to quite a few sessions already, but just in case. All right, here is, all sessions are being recorded. So after the conference is over, of course, there are a lot of sessions going on at the same time, and we have a lot of videos to try to generate and get up onto our servers. So it may be a little bit of time after the conference, but they will be posted to the conference website. Also, the materials have been posted to the website. I know there was kind of some confusion on how to download the materials or where it was actually located. So I'm just going to drag over my screen so I can show you. Right on the conference webpage, right under the session, this attachment icon, if you click on it, this will allow you to download the materials. Everybody is muted. But if you do have any questions throughout the session, do not hesitate to enter your questions into the Q&A. I have Nora and Anna from the help desk manning the Q&A during this session, and they will be, answering questions as fast as humanly possible. And if we do have some extra Q&A time at the end, they will pick some questions at random for me to answer verbally. Closed captioning is available. So if you do need closed captioning, just on your Zoom toolbar, there is an icon or a little button that says CC for your closed captioning, so you can have that option available. Also, real quick on the Q&A, it will be downloaded and sent to all attendees after the conference as well. So all the questions that Anna and Nora are answering will be sent to all of the attendees. All right, so we are going to touch a little bit on transactional reporting. So whether you don't do anything with reporting at all, it is still important to know this information, because everything that you do in SACE, every IEP, amendment, exit, it all ties back to CalPADS reporting. And it is just important to know how it works, how it functions, so that way you can understand why we have certain errors and validations in the system. CalPADS wants more real-time data. So when something occurs, when a meeting happens, they want that data, and that's also known as a transaction. So a transaction is created when you affirm an IEP. So when you affirm an IEP, which is your initial, your annual, or a triannual, a transaction is created for your district to report to CalPADS. Same as when a student is exited from special education, an exit will be created to be submitted to CalPADS. Also, after your initial meeting and a student's status is changed to ineligible, so maybe they were not found to be eligible for services, or they were found to be eligible, but they will not be receiving services. So these are your plan type 700, 800, 900 students. When a student is pending their initial evaluation, so when you receive parent consent and you select meeting type 30 and plan type 300, we will create a pending transaction to be submitted to CalPADS. CalPADS wants to know as soon as parent consent is received that the student is now pending an initial evaluation, so they kind of don't get lost. Also, when specific fields in an amendment are created, so not all amendments are reported to CalPADS, only certain ones. So I know this may sound like a lot of information or new information if you're a newer user, but nothing on the user end has changed. You are still just holding your meetings as normal, affirming, you're submitting your student change forms to request that a student be exited or the eligibility status to be changed. The importance now is to make sure that you're doing it in a timely manner. you need to affirm the IEPs and amendments in a timely manner. You need to submit your student change forms as soon as eligibility has been determined, or you know that a student's going to be exiting. And then on the admin side, really making sure that you are processing those requests in a timely manner, again, to get those, to create those transactions. And then of course, monitoring your homepage notice to kind of ensure that IEPs and amendments are being affirmed. So when I stated that specific fields, that if specific fields in an amendment are updated, these are those fields. So if any one of these fields are changed through that amendment process, we will create an amendment transaction. Now, again, nothing that you particularly need to worry about. You are just going to write your amendment as normal. But if any one of these fields have changed, we will just automatically create an amendment transaction for this meeting. All right, so now let's get into students, as this is where it all starts, is with the Add Student form. So whether the student is just referred to special education or they transferred in with an existing IEP, the provider is going to submit the Add Student form to request to have the student be added to their caseload. And then at the district level, we are going to look to see if this record exists anywhere in SACE or if we need to create a new record. So if a record does not exist, so you can see on the Add Student form, we have a couple of different criteria that we can try to search on: last name, first name, birthday, even SSID. So you'll definitely want to do a couple different checks to make sure that that record does not exist. It's very, very important that only one record exists per student. So if there's maybe a hyphen in the name, or you think that the name maybe has been transposed, definitely do a couple different options: last name, birth date, last name, birth date, and just try it again, just to verify that a record does not exist. And if the record does not exist, then you can continue with the rest of the Add Student form and have the student record added. If a record does exist, or if a record matches that criteria, you're going to see the results at the top of the page. And again, this is for the admin level users. So as a district level, the provider requested to have a student added to their caseload. It doesn't mean that the student doesn't already exist in the system, either in your district or in another district. They just need access to the student. So if you search for the student and you see a student record icon, that means that student is already in your district. And then you can simply click on the student record icon and add that student to the provider's caseload. If you only see the transfer icon, then that means that student record exists in another district, and then you're going to request to have that record transferred into your district. Now, as a SELPA level user, you may see both options. Because you have access to multiple districts, you may, if you're the one that's processing the request, this indicates that you have access to that student. However, if the student does actually need to be transferred to a different district, you will have to click the process transfer request. The only way a reporting LEA can be changed is through the transfer process. So if this was a new student, that new student record was added and they're pending an initial evaluation, or you just received parent consent, it is really important that these things get done. So you just received parent consent. You, of course, need to enter the parent consent date. Once you enter the parent consent date, you need to make sure that plan or meeting type 30 pending initial evaluation is selected, and that plan type 300 pending initial evaluation is selected. That's how SACE is going to know that this student is pending an initial evaluation and to create that pending record to be submitted to CalPADS. At the same time, this is also when the SSID number needs to be requested for the student. The student should also be enrolled into the SIS because that enrollment needs to align with this transaction. So it is really important that when you get parent consent, that all of this is done: requesting the SSID, making sure the student's enrolled, and making sure that meeting type 30 and plan type 300 is selected. So a couple different scenarios that we get at the help desk, and we thought we would give the answers here. Is the most common one is, well, what if the student moved in the middle of a moved in the middle of the assessment? So you were in the middle of assessing the student and the student moves. Well, since that initial evaluation has not been held yet, that student is still technically pending initial evaluation. So you are going to continue, you can release the record to the other district, keeping them as that plan type 300, meeting type 30. That pending transaction would have already been created in your district, and you can transfer a pending student if they are meeting type 30, plan type 300. Now, what if that student transferred into your district, but the assessment goes over the 60 days because they transferred in at day 59 or maybe day 65? In that case, if the assessment is overdue because of the transfer, then once that initial evaluation is actually held, then you're just going to select in the meeting delay code field 50 for transfer. And in that way, CalPADS knows that the reason why this initial eval was late was because the student transferred in already overdue or maybe just a couple days before it being due. If the student was found to be eligible during the initial evaluation, then you're just going to change the plan type to 100 and request that the student's eligibility status be updated to eligible. And then once it's made to eligible, then you will be able to affirm that IEP. If during that initial evaluation, it was determined that the student was not eligible for special education, or they were found to be eligible, however, the parent decided to place the child fully in a private school, no services from the district, or maybe they just declined the IEP, they just declined the offer. Or of course, then your 900 is just not eligible. So in those cases, you would just update the plan type appropriately and then submit the student change form to have your district change the eligibility status to DNQ or not providing services. All right, so your pending students, sounds pretty common sense. You know, we never really used to talk about the student section of the homepage until we started getting a lot of questions and we realized they were all tying back because the student was still pending. Nothing ever happened after the student transferred in or after that initial eval was held. So it is really important to take a look at your pending students to make sure that the students in your pending student list are truly pending their initial evaluation. So for example, if you take a look at your pending students, again, you can just click on pending right from your homepage, or from the upper navigation bar, you can click on students and then pending students. The only two types of students that you should see in this notice are students that have a referral date, a refer by, a parent consent date, and a plan type of 300 because they're pending an initial evaluation. Or maybe they just have a referral date and a referred by and everything else is blank because maybe their record just got added at the time of the referral and they just haven't received parent consent yet. Well, then that student is truly pending also. So those are the only two instances where you should see students in your pending student list. If you notice that, hey, this student on my list has initial evaluation date of December, and it looks like they were found to be not eligible for special education. They're still in a pending status, which means that student change form was not submitted, their status, their eligibility status was not changed to DNQ, and that DNQ transaction was not submitted to CalPADS. The kid's just kind of hanging out here. Another instance, you see that an initial eval was held and the student was found to be eligible for special education. They're a plan type 100. Well, we know because the student's pending that you can't affirm the IEP. So now nothing has happened with the student. They're still in a pending status. They haven't been made eligible and their IEP hasn't been affirmed. That's definitely a big no-no. And then lastly, if you do happen to see that there was an initial eval, but the plan type is still 300, you're going to want to contact the case manager and kind of figure out what the outcome of that meeting was. Were they eligible or were they not? So definitely take a look at your pending list and make sure that if anybody should be eligible, they are, and if anybody should be DNQ'd, that they are. All right, so let's move into the IEP. So a little bit about meeting type updates. I know this is kind of a touchy subject. We just got out of our CalPADS session and such, but with an IEP, that's pretty straightforward. It's an initial, an annual, or a triannual. Those are your meeting types. If an initial is held, only initial can be selected as the meeting type. So you can't say I'm doing an initial and an annual and a triannual all at the same time. So if initial is the purpose of the meeting or the meeting type, then that's the only option that can be selected. We will actually give you an error if you try to make any other selection. If an annual and a triannual is being held at the same time, please make sure you're selecting annual. Again, if an annual and a triannual is being held at the same time, you can select annual and triannual both in the meeting type field. Side little note about triannuals, because that's kind of where a little bit of the discussion is around, is that as of, gosh, I think it was year end last year, is where services are not included with a triannual transaction. So if during your meeting, if you have triannual selected and you're adding or updating services, those services will not be included with that triannual transaction. So if you are holding a meeting and you are updating services and other IEP information, and you are holding kind of like an IEP as well, then you just need to make sure that annual is selected as well. But if for some reason you are just holding a tri-only meeting and it is determined that the student is going to exit after that, when the student is exited, we will tie that exit date and reason back to that last annual transaction for the student, because exit dates cannot also be tied to the triannual. And I know this kind of gets more on the reporting side versus kind of the IEP side, but it is just important to know that information, because we did get a lot of reports to the help desk of, I'm submitting these transactions and, why aren't services being tied to them? Well, this was a triannual transaction. You indicated it was a tri-only meeting, and services cannot be included with a triannual. So just a couple things like that. All other meeting types are considered to be an amendment to the IEP. So you'll notice on the information eligibility form, there are only 3 allowed meeting types, and then every other meeting type is considered an additional purpose. And if that is the only purpose, say you're only doing an interim or a 30-day or an exit meeting, that is considered to be an amendment to the IEP. Side note as well, triannuals are not an amendment. Triannuals are a full meeting that should be done on the future IEP with triannual being selected. You cannot select a meeting type on the amendment form because you are amending an existing plan, and a triannual is not amending the annual. So that's why you're not able to select triannual through an amendment, and which is why a triannual transaction would not be created. So that's important, because we do get a lot of questions about that to the help desk as well. All right, so just real quick on the IEP lifecycle, this is just from the minute that the student record is created, everybody enters that information, the admin will enter all the demographic type information, the IEP team will use the future IEP forms to prep for the meeting. And after the meeting has been held, the case manager will affirm the IEP. That will turn it into the current IEP and also create that transaction for reporting. If there is an existing current IEP, that will be moved to the history. And as you affirm, that history will grow with all previously affirmed IEPs. And the information on the future IEP remains editable, because that's how you'll be able to prep for your next meeting. So a couple things to note. The future IEP is the editable copy. Everything links from the student record to the IEP, from the IEP back to the student record. There are 2 fields or 2 things that should not be updated prior to the meeting. One is the IEP meeting date. That is what has caused a lot of the errors in the system, a lot of these certification errors, where IEP dates are being updated too far in advance. And then, oh, what do you know? An amendment needs to be held. So we're prepping 3 weeks in advance. We have that future meeting date, and now it's been determined we need to hold an amendment meeting. We forget that we updated that date. We add an amendment now, and it just gets all tied wonky in the system, which is why we just released the new validation where if the future IEP date gets updated, that you cannot add an amendment, because then it's going to be out of sequence. So that is the purpose for that new error validation. So we want the IEP date to be updated at the time of the meeting, maybe the day before, but we don't want it 3 weeks, a month in advance, because that can cause some errors. The second thing is services. Because with services, you actually have to click a button to determine what you are going to do. You actually have to click continue, amend, discontinue. You cannot predetermine what is going to happen with those services before the meeting's held. We can't just say, oh yeah, I know the service is going to be discontinued. It wasn't that great. And then the parent at the meeting says, oh, that was the best service ever. I want to continue it to the next year. And you've already discontinued it and such. So now that a lot of these meetings are live, if you want to make the change during the IEP meeting, great. No problem there. It's just if you're prepping ahead of time and if for some reason you're going to come in with a hard copy, which is probably not being done right now, you just don't want to click those buttons and update those services before they're agreed upon. So on the future IEP, as you can see here, you have a lot of different options. Across the top, I'll start is you can add an attachment to the future IEP. You can add comments to the IEP. You can generate an e-signature package for a meeting that has been held but has not been affirmed yet. And then to edit the forms, you just click the edit icon. That will open the form for you. And there's kind of two different print options here. You see a print and a preview. What's really the difference? So the print option is the SACE print. So when you click the printer icon, that will give you the SACE available print options, whether you want to print in Spanish if the form's available, if you want the forms to print with a draft watermark, to page number, to remove page numbering and such. That's all done from the printer icon. And those print jobs will go to the print queue, which is in the top right-hand side of your page. The preview icon is just to do a quick preview of the form. It will bring up a PDF in whatever PDF viewer your computer has installed. So it may open up an Adobe Reader, but you only have the print options that are available through Adobe Reader or whatever your PDF viewer is. So you might not have the option to print in Spanish or print a draft watermark. So that's just the difference between those two icons. All right, so there are compliance checks on numerous of the forms. These compliance checks have been created by the State SELPA Forms Committee to try to help keep people within compliance. It's not going to prevent you from saving the page, but it's just going to give you an alert saying, hey, you know, no cannot be answered for this type of question, or you should have how the student participated in the process selected. You shouldn't be leaving that blank. So those are just more guiding questions and validations throughout the forms to ensure that everything is selected and is selected appropriately. Same as I said with the meeting type, that if for some reason you go to you go to the future IEP information eligibility form and you say, oh, I'm going to hold a transition meeting. And so you select transition, you're going to get the validation saying that if this is a transition meeting only, then that needs to be done as an amendment to the IEP. That is not considered to be a full IEP meeting. All right, so for managing services, like we had stated, is that once that service has been agreed upon, if the service is going to carry over to the next IEP year, then you're just going to click the continue button. So that is going to remove the old version of the service and replace it with the new version of the service. All of the service fields will be editable, so you can update the duration and frequency and start date, end date. You can edit everything except for the service code because you selected that you are going to continue this particular service code to that next IEP year. Since CalPADS only wants one version of the service reported, they do not want duplicate services or two of the same service being reported. This is not going to cause any type of error in the system, like you're underreporting or anything like that. If it has been determined that a service is going to be discontinued after the meeting, then you would just click the discontinue service button. From there, you'll just enter an end date, which will be the date that that service ended. It's not going to remain the end of that IEP year. It's going to be the date that that service actually ends. And once you discontinue a service, we will automatically mark it do not report. So that way, it does not get pulled into that CalPADS transaction, because if that service is not going to be provided for that next IEP year, we do not want that service captured because that would be over reporting. So once it's discontinued before you affirm, you can delete the service by just clicking the delete button. But if for some reason you happen to forget to delete the service, that's why we have it marked do not report, just so it doesn't get reported because it's not being provided. All right, so affirming the IEP. As we all know now that the IEP should be affirmed as soon as possible, as soon as the meeting is completed. Please note that affirming does not mean that the parent signed. It does not mean that it was agreed upon. It just is locking in place what happened at that meeting. It's saying, this is what was discussed. These are the forms we talked about. Let me lock this data in place. And that is what should be reported to CalPADS because that is what was discussed at that meeting. Now we'll go into next if there happens to be additional meetings to this. But the affirming it does not mean that it was signed or agreed upon. So to start that affirm process, you just click the affirm button. And then please, please, please verify the meeting information, verify the meeting date. Is this the correct date of that meeting? As I say, sometimes when people prep ahead of time and they start updating dates or a date changed, it became earlier, they forget to verify this date. And then after the IEP has been affirmed, there is no way to change that date. So please check the meeting date to make sure it was correct. Please check the meeting type. Was this just a triannual only, or was it an annual and a triannual, or was it whatever the meeting is? Make sure the appropriate meeting types are selected. And then you can verify the additional meeting dates as well, and then click continue. Again, once it's been affirmed, the user cannot update meeting date or meeting type. All right, so step 2 is checking to see if there's any CalPADS errors, because you will have to fix any errors before the IEP can be affirmed and for that transaction to be created. So once you fix all the errors, then you can just return back to the affirm process. And then next you will select the forms that were included in that meeting. So whatever form was discussed, you just check the box for each of those forms and then click the submit button. So all forms are actually, just so that you know, all forms are actually included in the affirm. It's just the forms that you selected will display bold on the current IEP as an indication that I use these 5 forms. Because if your SALPA has 30 forms listed, then you're going to have no way to know what forms were actually used during that meeting. So selecting the forms will just have them display as bold on the current IEP. Oh, there you go. So a couple little situations. So as we had just said, if you just affirmed the meeting, and this is where it gets a little, I don't want to say gray line, but we would just want to use with caution. That's why it's just really important that the meeting date and type is verified at the time of the affirm to alleviate any additional work. But if you did happen to just affirm and you're like, oh my goodness, I forgot to update the date, or this really was an annual as well, or whatever it may be, you can go back to the future IEP, update the meeting date or meeting type, whatever was incorrect, and reaffirm. Now that sounds simple, but that can only be done if nothing else has been done after that. Amendment hasn't been created or anything else. This is if you just affirmed and you realized that you made a mistake. That is when you can go back and update that meeting date, meeting type, reaffirm, and then you will need to submit a student change form to your district to alert them, hey, I reaffirmed this meeting because it had the incorrect date. So that way they can remove that transaction from being reported to CalPADS. That is really important. So to alleviate all that additional extra work, just verify that that information is correct before you affirm. If you affirm the IEP, but you forgot to input information, this is, a same one. Oh, I just affirmed, I forgot that I didn't enter my goals, or I forgot to continue the services, but I already affirmed. Do I create an amendment for that? So as of, we just heard in the CalPADS session that it sounds like they're going to make this just a warning, but as of yesterday, or as of technically today, it's still an error, where the amendment date cannot be the same date as the IEP date. So if it would not make sense that you would amend a meeting on the same day that you held the meeting. It sounds like there has been some other situations where maybe that needs to occur so that they will actually actually end up relaxing this error. But as of the system now, it is an error until that is confirmed that the error will be removed. But in this situation, you can go back. So you just held the meeting and you're like, oh, I forgot to add my goals. Oh, I forgot to discontinue this service. You can go back to the future IEP, make that update and reaffirm. And trust me, as I'm saying this, it is hard because we've always gone against reaffirming because it does kind of create an accurate history. But with kind of how CalPADS is going now and only being able to do amendments in certain situations, and these two cases, you would have to go back to the future IEP to reaffirm. So again, just making sure that all that information is entered correct before that affirm occurs. All right, so this is what the IEP transaction looks like. So this is what your district or your SALPA sees. So they'll see that, okay, this student had an IEP. It was held on July 21st. And the transaction, you can see that they affirmed on that same day, and it was a meeting type 20, which is an annual, and the transaction type is an affirmed IEP. This is what your district is seeing for transaction-wise and what they are submitting to CalPADS. So going into your current IEP. So your current IEP should be an exact replication of the hard copy that the parent received. So again, as we say, the forms that will display in bold are the forms that you selected during that affirm process. However, the printer icon is still available for the forms that were not selected. You can still print those out separately. You can create amendments to the current IEP, add comments, attachments, and generate an e-signature package from the current IEP. And once the current IEP, this is your IEP history page. So your first meeting here is going to display your current IEP. And then every meeting before that, of course, will be historical meetings. So you can see every IEP that's ever been held for the student. And to view that IEP, you can just click on the view print icon. That will take you to that student's IEP to review and or print those forms. All right, so let's go into amendments. So once the IEP has been affirmed, now we're talking about a real amendment, not just making a change like on that same day. So once the IEP has been affirmed, any change to that IEP must go through that amendment process. So if it's been a month later and all of a sudden it's been decided that, oh, we need more services, less services, removing a goal, adding a goal, anything that's making a change to the IEP is going to be done through that IEP process. The future IEP will not be updated until that next IEP is held. So yeah, for the amendment, you can use it for continuation meetings, a traditional amendment to make a change to the IEP, to hold your transition meetings, intern placements, exits, and things like that. Those are all considered to be an amendment to the IEP. So adding an IEP, I did a screenshot of these because these are the newer validations that we had added. So from the current IEP, when you click on the amendment tab and you click the add amendment button, we're going to do two different validations. We are going to verify that a transaction exists because we now know that if an amendment is going to be created, that IEP to that amendment has to already be created in the district. That transaction has to be adopted. So that way you can do an amendment, because you can't just submit the amendment to CalPADS without having that source or that original IEP transaction. So if the transaction does not exist in the district, the student just transferred in, but your district has not adopted that IEP yet, you're going to get an alert saying you cannot add an amendment until that IEP transaction has been adopted. As we already stated, with not updating the future IEP date, if for some reason that you added an amendment and then you went to the future IEP and updated the date because you're going to start also prepping for the next meeting, if that future IEP date changes from the current IEP date, you are going to get an error. You are not going to be able to continue with that amendment. It is going to alert you that if a new meeting has not been held, to change that future IEP date back to the current IEP date. So again, so those dates are aligned. But if another meeting has been held, you will need to affirm that meeting first to make sure that this amendment is tied to the correct IEP. That was the issue in some of the CalPADS was explaining in their session, where things were getting out of sync because IEPs weren't being affirmed, but yet they were creating and affirming amendments and they were just getting tied incorrectly. All right, so this was about the amendment date. If the amendment date is the same as the meeting date, you're going to get an error. And again, once that is released, that this will no longer be an error, we will remove this validation. All right, so the amendment purpose. The amendment purpose is the same field. We just added those fields that were under the additional purpose on the information eligibility form to the amendment purpose field, because truly these are all the reasons why an amendment would be created. And I'm sure there's some additional reasons, which is why we have the other options selected. So if you are adding an amendment, you will select the amendment purpose, and the amendment purpose is required to affirm. So if you don't select it here, you're going to get a warning saying that it's required, but at the time of the amendment affirm, it will be required. If you do need to edit the amendment forms, then you just scroll down to the bottom of the page and click the edit icon for the form that you need to update. And there are certain fields that cannot be updated. As we stated, that you cannot update the meeting type through an amendment. There are certain fields that will result in an error if they are updated through the amendment process. The fields are listed here. And the two most common fields is plan type and parent involvement. Those seem to get changed a lot through amendments, and that is not allowed. If you're going from a 100 to an ISP to a 200 or vice versa, that has to be done through the IEP. And for amending services between, you are doing an amendment, and if a service is going to be amended between the IEP years, then that's when you'll click the amend service button, and then you'll enter an end date for when that version of the service is going to end. Don't leave it the end of the IEP year. So end date for that version of the service. And then when you click continue, you'll be able to update any field on that service grid with the new service information. And then once you click save, you'll see the tag here that this is an amended service, and it will be automatically be marked do not report, so it does not get reported to CalPADS. If any of those CalPADS reportable fields are updated, that's when it's going to generate that amendment transaction, and that would include those services as well. And to affirm the amendment, you'll just click on the affirm button. And if somebody happens to be maybe on, because the future IEP forms and the amendment forms are linked, if somebody happens to be editing that form, whether it be on the future IEP or the amendment, you will get alert letting you know that somebody is currently editing that form. And on the amendment confirmation page, this is going to display the amendment date, the purpose that was selected on the amendment form. And we've always had a amendment signature field, but we did add not applicable because if not all amendments or not all reasons why you would create a particular amendment do require a signature. So that will not populate the unsigned amendment notice on your homepage. So if it's for some reason a signature is not required for this particular amendment, then you would just you would select non-applicable. If you select no, that's what will populate your unsigned amendment homepage notice. And we will do a services error check because services, of course, are tied to amendment transactions. We do want to make sure that all of the errors are corrected to alleviate any additional errors into CalPADS. And then you will just select the forms that were used in that amendment meeting and click submit. And this is your affirmed amendment grid. So from here, you can see that, so this is the current IEP, you clicked on the amendment tab. This is the view print icon, so you can view or print those amendment forms. This is the date the amendment, or this is the amendment date and when it was added and who affirmed it. And this will also display the purpose here. So here's the purpose that was selected on the amendment form. And then we do also have If you did happen to generate an e-signature package from the amendment, because a student can have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 amendments, this is an easy way to see that if an e-signature is in process for any one of the affirmed amendments. And this is what that amendment transaction looks like. So what this is saying that you, on this date was the actual meeting. So we held an initial on March 27th. And then on July 24th, we held an amendment to that meeting. And this is an amendment transaction. So again, that's how that transaction, what it looks like, how it's created, and then again, submitted to CalPADS. So what to do in this particular instance? We talked a lot about amendments, and then this is the question that we always get from here, is that this student transferred in from out of state. I can't do an amendment. There is no IEP. Where do I go from here? If you happen to be in my next session for creating IEP transactions, we do go over this process. But if the student transfers in from an out of state or a non-SACE district, then that IEP has to be established in SACE. So if there's no student record, there's no IEP in SACE, you're going to take that hard copy and you are going to enter that information into SACE, affirm it to create that IEP transaction so that you can add an amendment to make any changes now that the student is in your district. So I know that was just a brief explanation of that. We do actually have this information in our training material. So under the Help Center, under training materials, this is for the initial CalPADS affirm students transferring from a non-SACE district. So this will go step by step on how to document that student's IEP that came from out of state or a non-SACE district, how to put that IEP into SACE so that you can create an amendment to make any changes. All right, so we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, depending on how long they are. So Anna or Nora, what do you have for me?
Okay, I have a question from Brooke Bohall. I hope I pronounced your name right. What if there are the kids are only receiving speech services, and then they are being tested by a psych or RSP for additional services? Would that be done via an amendment?
Additional services, that one, oh, good question. Thanks, Anna. Is that additional services, that is a little bit different depending on if you are going to consider that to be a full another assessment or not. Like if you are going to consider that to be part of like another triannual to like do more assessing of a student versus doing an amendment just to add another service. So that one, I would probably refer you back to your district to see, depending on the type of assessment and stuff, is this considered like a full another assessment to consider that just another triannual, or if you're just adding a service, then at that point, it would just be an amendment. All right, another one.
All right, Christy, we have a few questions on the blank grids for services. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So the blank grids, that is a way, because we say we don't want to kind of predetermine those services ahead of time. So if we say, you know what, there's a service that I want to offer the student, I think it's going to be a really good service. We don't want to write that right into the IEP and have it already in the IEP at the time of the meeting. At that point, the blank grid, when you print out that services form, will just print out a blank service grid where you can actually write in that information. This is the service that I'm going to provide and that service information, so that when you go into the meeting, you can say, hey, this is what we were thinking. And if they agree to that, you know, then they can initial it or whatnot. I know, again, that most of the meetings are live now, so maybe the blank grids probably won't be an option that's used during these virtual meetings, but that is the purpose of the blank grids. All right, Anna. We'll just go back and forth.
Okay, I have a question that came in from an anonymous attendee. They're asking, if you affirm an IEP that does not yet have a parent signature and you notice errors, can you just delete that affirmed IEP and fix what you need? Or would you have to do a correction amendment?
I guess it depends on what, I mean, you can't have errors affirm. So you have to be CalPADS error free in order to affirm. So if you mean errors like you just forgot to update something, I guess I would need to know what kind of errors you're referring to know how the correction process would go. All right, I think we probably have time for one more question so that I don't get cut off in the middle of answering a question. All right, Nora, do you happen to have a question for me?
Okay, so if a parent revokes consent to continue assessments, should the SACE record be marked as do not report in DNQ?
So if they decide to revoke consent, this one actually did went back and forth a couple times. So at first, yes, the initial response is if they revoke consent, well, there's no consent and there is going to be no assessment that's done. So they are not pending an initial evaluation. So you're kind of going backwards. So the minute you get parent consent, you're selecting that they're pending initial evaluation for their meeting type and plan type. Well, if they revoke that consent, well, they're not waiting on initial assessment anymore because it's been revoked. So at that time, we're kind of going backwards. You're going to deselect your plan type, deselect your meeting type, and remove that parent consent because that is no longer needed because we don't want to base any type of timelines on something that has been revoked. I haven't heard of any other type of update with that if it needs to be reported a certain way. And it's been this process for quite some time now. So unless something new that came in that I am unaware of, then yes, that is the process. Then you would just actually remove that parent consent date and the plan type and meeting type so that the only thing left is just a referral and that student wouldn't be reported. All right, and the session, just to let you know, will automatically cut off at 2:20. So I'm trying to watch the time as answering a question. So that way, again, we both don't happen to get cut off. Just in case, I do want to say thank you for everybody who attended today. I know the virtual is a new type of thing for conferences, and I really wish that I could have seen everybody live. That would have been great. But thank you so much for attending the session. I hope that you got a lot of information out of it and that when you go back to work on Monday, you have a new outlook on how to process information. So thank you, and I will, we're gonna cut it too close. So I'm just gonna say thank you, everybody. And again, the Q&A that Nora and Anna have been answering will be sent to all attendees after the conference. Thank you, everyone.